Thank you for having me here today. My perspective on density comes from a number of different angles, and today I've got 7 minutes to share with you some of those. So we're going to go through 45 slides in 7 minutes. So pay attention, please. It's interesting to have heard from Edward, because a lot of the themes that Edward is talking about are represented here. The idea that entrepreneurs are part of our cities, and I'm going to speak from a Vancouver perspective, is critical to what I'm talking about today. And it's a bit of a radical idea, but hopefully it spurs some conversation. So what do we mean by proactive design of density? What do we mean by thinking of the industrial idea of the way we segregate cities differently? Well, let me talk to you about that. And I'm going to begin with some trends and backgrounds that some of you might be familiar with, but in particular, there's a couple of them that I think are important. This one comes from the city of Vancouver. We're all very familiar with the current mayor's task force on green initiatives to be the greenest city. Certainly, Sam was very involved, and I was as well, with eco-density. If you look here, Vancouver has a lot of work to do in that regard. And part of that work is around mixed use, something we're very familiar with in Vancouver, and I speak about a lot in other jurisdictions. But in particular, I don't think we're thinking of mixed use the way we should be. Everybody's familiar with this particular chart in Vancouver. This is our famous zoning bylaw, a very small piece of it, which talks about the M zones, which are industrial zones in Vancouver. And for those of you that don't know, they are located throughout areas near the downtown, largely, and some a little bit further out. But what is zoning? One of my partners reminded me that zoning is maybe 70 to 90 years old. And perhaps if you think of Edward's thoughts, that's a pretty short time frame in the life of cities. Some other statistics in Vancouver, if we look at 3 of these pieces of the pie, these are the amount of what we would call historically industrial jobs in Vancouver. These are the 3 sectors that produce jobs in the city in a manufacturing-related way, and they're shrinking radically. This is an interesting book. I encourage anybody who reads a lot to read this book. This was given to me by a partner of mine. It's a Canadian author. And it's talking about cities around the world, and this phenomenon lately of what this author's talking about is there's a new wave of migration in the world. And in particular, there's cities around the world that are arrival cities. And Vancouver, for anybody who's been here for some time, realizes that we are one of those. Toronto is obviously the key one in the country, but there's many others. And within that, the interesting part of this for me as an urban designer is that these people that arrive are trying to start a new life. They're trying to be entrepreneurial. That's part of who they are. And unfortunately, a lot of the cities that we're creating don't allow for that upon arrival. They allow instead for people to be shoehorned into existing situations, often not taking account of their previous history and education. And I think Vancouver suffers from that greatly. And in particular, unlike Edward's thought, I think space is a key component of that, and maybe I'm biased because I'm an architect, but this is a part of Paris that you may be familiar with because it had a significant amount of rioting and damage over the last few years. This is an arrival city, but it doesn't look like parts of Vancouver. It doesn't have engagement with the street. It doesn't have life at the street. It doesn't have a mix of uses. It doesn't allow for anything but housing in a very segregated way. And I think many do, including this author, that that's contributed significantly to the problems of that area. So we need to think about that type of thing. This is another book that it's so tattered. Now, most of my books are in perfect condition, but this one I've leafed through so many times, and I have never really finished it. I keep going backwards and forwards in it, but it's a fascinating book, and I won't bore you with all the details here, but it's basically talking about the change in the way computing and technology will be changing the nature of work, and in fact, the nature of humanity itself. I'm not going to get into that part because that's a very controversial part of it. But essentially, it's saying that the decline in the ability for humans to interact in the manufacturing process, in fact, in the process of making anything, is declining rapidly, and that this will continue to decline, this author argues, to the point of 0. So that's another thing to keep in mind in terms of what manufacturing is. Some of you might have read this. This is a recent article in The Economist, which is talking about the same kind of thing. And essentially, I'm not going to read this, but if you can read it quickly, that'd be great. Manufacturing in traditional areas is changing rapidly today, and it's changing in the Western world probably faster than anywhere. And interestingly, just a side note, what this author is suggesting that many of these jobs are going to return to the first world, if you were, because the nature of labor is changing. So again, I'm just getting everybody to think about the nature of labor and the word manufacturing and what we call industrial in terms of zoning here. So some of you might be familiar with this. This is in the article, and it's certainly been well documented elsewhere. 3D printers are now a technology that's available. And of course, like any technology, the cost of them is going to come down very quickly. And what that will allow people to do is, within your own unit, within your own house, wherever you live, is to create three-dimensional objects of any sort by yourself, obviously fundamentally changing what we think about manufacturing. And for some reason, this slide doesn't fit on the screen. But in any event, another point on the traditional manufacturing, this is on the east coast of the US, which has obviously been a historic manufacturing center. In a similar article. So in turning to Vancouver, why is density in Vancouver unique? Well, there's a number of things. The first one is land resources. We're in one of the unique places in the world where we're very constrained, and the price of land is very expensive. We are an arrival city, as mentioned from the previous book, and we're on an advanced path, being one of the newer cities on the planet, of a different type of economy, and Edward touched on that as the nature of jobs and employment changes. We're well down that path. This is a slide I usually use when I'm not in Vancouver, but I will quickly remind everybody from a space view what those constraints are. So that's where we have to build things, and the little green circle on the right, of course, is the ALR, which we hopefully will preserve. So very quickly, what are some approaches? Well, Vancouver is very famous for this type of construction. I didn't pick the Olympic Village just to show the Olympic Village. This could be any tower in Vancouver, where we've contracted ourselves to floor spacing that is 8 foot, 8.5 inches. And I always question what this can be in the future. We've designed into the structure something that's very hard to adapt. And in particular, what about employment? I mean, what about the ground floors of these buildings? What about the idea of thinking three-dimensionally in zoning? I don't know if we've thought about that at all. And yes, we are questioning Vancouver. To Edward's point, I think it's important to question Vancouver. Transit is obviously a key component of density and of what I'm talking about in terms of jobs. But I think we need to think of land use quite differently as we move forward. Sorry, I'm looking back because the screen keeps dying on me here. So inclusive of what? Well, what I'm largely getting at is we need to think about zoning in a sense. It's not even zoning. We need to think about buildings and structures three-dimensionally. And important things happen when you take your brain out of the zoning brain and think of those things. So while I'm saying there can be residential at the main floor, I'm also saying that's the ideal place for incubator spaces, for job spaces. And if we think of them as employment spaces and not manufacturing, we can get out of the language of M zoning and I zoning and think about what those spaces can be. They're job-producing spaces, essentially. They're incubator spaces, a la the idea that we are an arrival city. They can be industrial in a sense. There's not a lot of smoky, dirty things produced in this city, and it looks like in the future there won't be either. And what are the key elements of some of those spaces? And how do we structure them in a way that they might work? Because often when I talk about this, I get a lot of things thrown at me suggesting this can't work, especially in the Vancouver context. Well, one thing we need to do is protect the tax structure that allows for industrials. In other words, if we're zoning the bottom of a building for employment, we need to capture that in perpetuity so that the value of the land is not passed on to that tenant, and the increase in rent, the increase in taxes doesn't charge them out to the suburbs. So we have to build in some policy around that. We have to protect the grade level for flexible uses so that we allow for different things to happen over time. We're building things into our structures in Vancouver and elsewhere that I don't think are useful. We need to think about stratifying residential use. So if we put residential above what we would traditionally call manufacturing or industrial areas, that's split off in a sort of conceptual way and doesn't interfere with that. In Vancouver, we link them together. We think one is replacing the other. And in fact, I think we can have more job space if we think about it three-dimensionally. And in fact, on the rental housing suggestion, the idea of affordable housing in Vancouver, a very big issue, which I'm also involved in, it's important to look at this as an opportunity for that, because there's places that can be above work and employment that could be for rental. And again, this could increase actually the amount of space available. And I would estimate there's at least 4 to 5 million square feet available. So very quickly, just to finish up, this is another area that we're investigating right now in our firm, which is a subject of mixing of uses in a very unique way. But what we consider mixed use may not be what everybody considers mixed use, because it does involve these other pieces. And this is a long thesis that I can go into, but essentially these elements make great mixed use communities through time. And it's important to note that it clearly includes production. The nature of production is changing, and I think as a city and as planners, we need to think about that very carefully. Just some examples quickly to finish up from Vancouver. This is a competition form shift that everybody's probably familiar with in Vancouver. This was a site down by the Fraser River, which talked about layering things on top of actually fairly traditional industrial uses, in this case, rental housing and hotel. This is not far from our office, a project very simple that the zoning typically does not allow, but that is residential above a car repair area. It's been working there for 20 years. And then we look at places like the Rust Belt in the east of the country and of the continent, where things have changed rapidly. The design of this particular structure has changed to this, where obviously the uses of these older buildings has changed, the nature of work has changed, and the space itself has changed. In Auckland, here's a building that was an experiment, but one that's worked fairly successfully, where even warehousing is under residential. If you think about it, a lot of those uses end at 5 o'clock. So really, what is the impact on residential? Some of the architecture around that. If we think about many places around the world, these conditions are already built in. The grade level of most of the rest of the world tends to have this kind of incubator space, and I think there's less concern over what's in that. We need to remember that. Some other examples from Australia, eastern part of the country, Paris. Forms we're familiar with. This is Hong Kong, where I don't think people pay quite as much attention to lateral zoning, but certainly three-dimensional zoning. This is in the Middle East. And then finally, just some quick shots. This is what happens when you have a land resource issue. This is Japan, and this is a vertical industrial building. So even our warehousing, our use of land in the suburbs, where we have acres and acres of land used for trucking and parking, is kind of absurd, because other areas with these kinds of land values are already stacking that use onto itself, let alone putting residential on top of it. This is truck circulation, so semis can get all the way to the top. And finally, to end, a very good example from Vancouver, where partners in our firm, who certainly designed Granville Island and helped over the years, have fought to keep industry in downtown Vancouver, to keep the activity and the jobs and the blue-collar nature of downtown Vancouver alive. It's one of the few remaining places of that. Thank you very much.